Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Aristotle's Rhetoric, or on Rhetoric. It's an excerpt from Rhetoric, and particularly how it pertains to Plato's Allegory of the Cave, both of which we'll be reading this week. So I'm going to take it to a share screen in just a moment. Before I begin, as always, I like to remind you that if you have any questions beyond what is shared in this video, beyond sort of my further explanation of the readings, just make sure that you either email me at kking@fullcall.edu, Canvas message me, or you can visit me during Zoom office hours. And if none of my posted office hours work for you, whether they be on Zoom or in person, please know that you can also always contact me and set up a time that works for you for Zoom. I can do that. So without further ado, I'll take it to the share screen and I will share my gorgeous PowerPoint with you. So we're talking about Aristotle's On Rhetoric, and we're talking about Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Well, let's start with Aristotle. Let's start with rhetoric. So what is rhetoric? Well, rhetoric actually comes from a Greek word, rhetorike, which means public speaking. Because back in the day in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, when they were switching from tyrant models of rule to democratic models of rule, or at least I'll say more democratic models of rule, not fully democratic, because as we know, certain citizens such as women, enslaved people, and immigrants in those societies, for the most part, by and large, could not vote. Anyway, as we're switching in those, few hundred years, century BCE, we are going from tyrant rule, and not with the negative connotation necessarily that we see today, but tyrant rule just means absolute rule, meaning one person has the power and dictates what everyone else should do, must do. Whereas democracy, there are at least more people involved in deliberating what should be done for a society. And rhetoric comes about as democracy comes about. Some people credit that to a guy named Corax. Aristotle is not far off in terms of time to Corax. I'll leave it up to you to do your research on the history of rhetoric and classical Greek civilizations, but that's what some people say. Anyway, rhetoric means public speaking. Why? Well, in those olden days, most people didn't write. Most people could speak, but they couldn't write. And so you had, with the emergence of democracy, you had these councils, you had these deliberative bodies where people would go and essentially plead their cases in front of these governing bodies, these deliberative bodies. So you needed to have a sort of set of guidelines or an art form to that. And that's how rhetoric developed. And one of the main texts that still influences a majority of what we talk about in terms of Western rhetoric today is Aristotle's The Rhetoric, or On Rhetoric. And we're going to talk about some of the main aspects of rhetoric in this PowerPoint. So rhetoric, rhetorique, public speaking, because these people would speak their case. Then, as more and more people throughout the centuries become literate, you have the shift from rhetoric pertaining only to public speaking to rhetoric pertaining to writing, which is what we're doing clearly in this class. Nowadays, the contemporary definition of rhetoric is the art of persuasion or argument. And its primary concern is making some sort of judgment, typically, again, based on looking at all the facts in the case, looking at all of the perspectives in the case. In other words, doing research, if we're going to put it into the context of this writing class. So we have to do our research. We have to understand not just one side or another side, but all of the multiple perspectives, all of the possible information that we can get, and consider the possible outcomes. That's when we make the judgment. It is founded in possibility, not proof absolute. Again, throughout the centuries, there have been a lot of critics of rhetoric, a lot of times likening it to charlatanism, to being slippery and slick, because we're not dealing with actual factual stuff, like someone, say, a mathematician or a philosopher who is dealing solely in logic and that which can be empirically understood by the senses, understood by the tangible world and our interaction with it, right? We're dealing with things that could happen, that may not exist right now in the corporeal world, but could potentially exist. So that's why you get this criticism of rhetoric, because it relies on the intangible. Sometimes it relies on faith. Sometimes it relies on just having all of the information we have in the moment and deciding on what we're going to do from there. So in On Rhetoric, Aristotle discusses the Pisteis, and forgive me if I'm not saying that correctly, or proofs. There are artistic proofs and there are inartistic proofs. Well, when you think of an artist, right, a lot of times we've got to think about these words and sort of do some mnemonic device work, so to speak, so that these ideas make sense to us. The mnemonic device I will share with you is the artist, right? If you think of an artist creates something from imagination, from thought, from their mind. So artistic proofs are things that are created or invented by the rhetor. And if rhetoric is the art of argument, then a rhetor is in and of herself a kind of artist. She's an artist with words, right? Maybe she's not a sculptor, maybe she's not a rapper, but she is her own type of artist. So artistic proofs are invented by the rhetor. They are arguments, they are claims, they are analysis, they are hypotheticals, and those are all things, as we go along in this course, we'll delve more deeply into. Inartistic proofs, on the other hand, are what we find to support the argument. In other words, the actual factual, the data, the evidence. So these are what, in any given case, in any given argument, already exist, have already been, not even necessarily need to have been proven, but are empirically found. So they're not necessarily created by the rhetor and her imaginative mind, they already exist. She gathers them to help further the artistic aspect of rhetoric, if that makes sense, right? Just like we do in our essays. If I'm creating an argument, for example, bubblegum ice cream is gross, that's my creation, because someone else can create the argument, bubblegum ice cream is delicious. And we're both going to use inartistic proofs to help further the artistic aspect of that argument, right? We're going to talk about the color, we're going to talk about the texture, we're going to talk about the taste, we're going to talk about the guy at Thrifty who was rude to me the last time I ordered a bubblegum ice cream, when I got sick off of it, whatever the case. So neither of these is one more important than one another, in the sense that we both need them for our arguments. Because if you just give an essay that's all facts, there's no argument there. If you just give an essay that's a bunch of opinions with nothing to back it up, you lose credibility. And that's what we're going to talk about in a moment. Because credibility speaks to one of the three appeals. And those three appeals, a lot of you may have already discussed them in other courses. So if this is a refresher, awesome. If not, also awesome. The three appeals are appeals to ethos, logos, and pathos. And let's break down each one of those. Appeals to ethos deal with a rhetor's character, knowledge, authenticity, work output, reputation, in other words. They tend to deal with ethics, but not always. And the example I used yesterday in my 103 class, when I talked about these exact same things, was, if you think about like the song Straight Outta Compton by NWA, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with that song. In that song, and you can look up the lyrics yourselves, I won't share them here for reasons A, B, and C that I'll keep to myself. But if you look at those lyrics, yeah, there's expletives, Yeah, there are discussions of things that we might not consider ethical in the traditional sense, but they speak to the rapper's credibility as rappers. So one thing to keep in mind with appeals to ethos is we have to consider the context, right? A rapper has to share different traits or criteria to prove his credibility than, say, a college professor does to prove her credibility, right? If I have to prove my credibility as your English professor, I talk about my education. I talk about the scholarly journal articles that I've published. I talk about the years that I've been teaching. I talk about the awards that I've earned as an instructor, and on and on and on. Now, if somebody like Eazy-E is proving his credibility as a rapper, particularly as a gangster rapper from Southern California in the late 80s and early 90s, he's going to talk about things like his vigilantism, right? How he does not trust police because of the overwhelmingly suffocating political atmosphere for Black people in Southern California at the time. He's going to talk about the groups with which he identifies. He's going to talk about perhaps the unlawful activity in which he's engaged. And because he's a gangster rapper in the early 90s, that speaks to the credibility of someone from that group. So we have to consider the context when we're talking about appeals to ethos. We, for the most part, have pretty decent, what I'll just call BS detectors when it comes to certain things. But there are other things in our society and culture where we have been bamboozled. And one of those things is the ways in which we research. And so appeals to ethos are very important because you should always be asking yourself, who is the person sharing this information? Do they have the credibility to do so? And are they authentic? And if the answer is no, a red flag in your rhetorical radar should go off. Okay, let's talk about appeals to logos. Appeals to logos deal with the content of the text the rhetor presents. Well, what does that mean? That's about as vague as we can get, right? Appeals to logos, yes, are based in logic, right? And they deal with some of the inartistic proofs that we've talked about, like data, statistics, factual evidence, histories, things like that. But they also deal with the logic of the argument itself. Does the argument logically follow? Is the way that the person presents their case, presents their argument, presents their art, presents their text, does it follow logically? And if not, how is the appeal to logos negatively affected by that? So logos deals just as much with data, facts, and statistics as it does with the way that we present those items so that they make sense to the reader and the reader can logically follow them. So keep that in mind because a lot of people struggle with appeals to logos and they're a lot easier than we think they are. And sometimes they're a little more complicated. Let's talk about appeals to pathos. Appeals to pathos deal with the emotions the rhetor is attempting to elicit from the audience. One huge one that we see in our society, in our contemporary American society today, is fear-mongering. Appeals to pathos can be effective, but sometimes they can fall into the territory of fallacies of argument, meaning they hurt more than they help. And so if you think about fear-mongering, for example, and the political environment in which we live, a lot of the fear-mongering that we're seeing, maybe a small fraction of it is to help us protect ourselves, be safe. But when it goes to a level that is out of balance, that is extreme, then it can be hurtful and harmful. So, for example, we've all seen those videos, you know, with the dogs, where they're, you know, one's got like an eye missing and they're out in the snow and the Sarah McLachlan song is playing in the background. That's an example of, that's a pretty standard example of an appeal to pathos. And the reason why is because it's trying to get something immediate. And that's usually when appeals to pathos are used. When we're trying to convince people either quickly en masse, or we're trying to convince people who aren't educated on the rules of logic. So you can fool a lot of unsuspecting people if they are ignorant of these ideas. And again, we see that constantly in the political arenas in our culture, on any side of the political spectrum. So when we use appeals to pathos, we should use them sparingly, but we should also use them smartly. For example, sometimes in my writing, I like to share a little clever, cheeky, quasi joke. I like to, you know, fit something in between all the logic and analysis I'm sharing. The reader laughs. Laughter can be seen as a form of consent. It gets people to agree with us more readily. And so that's helpful. Now, if all I did was in an academic essay was share jokes and expletives and body language, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, that's my dog Coleslaw. She's barking at the mailman. What a cliche. If we use those, if we overuse those, right? If in my scholarly essay I did nothing but crack jokes, then I would lose credibility because I wouldn't be showing the scholarly rigor with which I was approaching my subject matter. So the other thing to keep in mind is that these appeals sometimes work with and affect one another. So I would say in my conclusion to this slide, if you're going to use any one of these three the most, it's going to be appeals to logos. Next, appeals to ethos, by doing your research, showing you've done the work, showing that you are a credible voice that is sharing your argument. And then use the appeals to pathos sparingly, just enough to kind of get your audience to be engaged. These also walk us into the rhetorical triangle. So if we think about the appeal to ethos, that's the writer, the rhetor, the person sharing the argument, the rapper, the sculptor, the singer, whoever is sharing whatever type of argument we're looking at. And so we have to make sure that that person is credible. When we think about logos, that's that context. The majority of your essay is going to be not only in artistic proofs of valuable information that you're sharing with your reader, but your intelligent analysis of that information. So logos is both artistic and inartistic, right? You use the factual, data-driven information, but you also do the critical analysis work to show its relevance, its importance, etc. And then pathos is, again, where you connect with your audience. So when we think about that rhetorical triangle, and within this triangle itself is the argument. This blue area is what comprises the argument. We've got all of those elements. Now, one thing to keep in mind, arguments are not static. They are affected by the writer, they are affected by the audience, and they are affected by the context. And here's what I mean by that: the content and the context. Arguments we are making about race in America today are very different than arguments we were making 100 years ago. The people who are sharing those arguments, by virtue of everyone over 100 years ago probably being deceased, if not close to it by now, they've changed. So our writers, our rhetors, our speakers have changed, which means that the content of the argument has changed, which also means our audience and how we connect with our audience has changed. So in other words, when any one aspect or multiple aspects of this triangle change, the whole thing changes. And that's another reason why rhetoric is slippery, because life is dynamic. Every single moment is a new moment. We can never stop and be still. It's impossible. Change is inevitable. So we have to make the most timely, the most relevant, and the strongest arguments in the given space and time in which we exist. If you're going to argue about, I don't know, nobody should get divorced, right? That's kind of an argument that time and divorce lawyers have proven is not going to happen anymore, right? People are going to get divorced. So that's why we have to stay current with what we're discussing. And according to Aristotle, there are 3 reasons why rhetors are persuasive: wisdom, or the term used phronesis, virtue, and goodwill. There's another guy who I teach in my 103 by the name of Quintilian, and he talks about the good person speaking well. And then the Jesuits come by 1,000 years later or so and add for the public good to that. So good person speaking well for the public good, a person who is wise, a person who is virtuous, and a person who has goodwill or is altruistic, right? Means the best for everyone else. Because let's think about some of these rhetors who are not doing that in contemporary society. Let's think about the Alex Joneses of the world, who don't necessarily have society's best interests at heart, but instead want to make that money by lying to their audience. They do immense harm, immense damage. Think about the families of the Sandy Hook victims that confronted Alex Jones and the pain, the deep pain that must have caused these people. But again, when you are someone like Alex Jones, who has an audience that is largely uneducated as to media literacy, as to how to do proper research, as to what the parameters of effective argument are, and somebody like Alex Jones, who preys so much on pathos, on people's fears, who relies so heavily on that, then you're going to fall into those very dangerous ruts, unfortunately, and people will get hurt in the process. So it's incredibly important to have someone who is wise, who is virtuous, and who is doing rhetoric for the goodwill of society. Because if you don't, again, we can fall into some really dangerous traps. Now, are these concepts ambiguous? Are they abstractions? Are they relative to whoever we're talking to? Of course, right? Somebody from a very evangelical Christian background is going to have a very different idea about what the good of society is versus someone who is atheistic, agnostic, comes from a much less sort of evangelical background. They're going to have different views, and that's both the beauty and the sticking point of rhetoric, is that everybody has a different opinion, that possibility, that slipperiness, that potential for anything. So that's why these conversations we've been having have been going on for at least 2,700 years, when again these people, these thinkers were coming up. So it's cool. That's why I do this and not math, because math, you got 1, maybe 2 right answers at the most, and you're done. And if you get it wrong, you're wrong. Whereas rhetoric, you can argue any number of things. And as long as you have the research to back it up, as long as you've got the credibility, as long as you are providing compelling analysis with what you're doing that persuades your audience, the possibilities are endless. So I love it. And also because if you make a mistake, it's not like an algebra equation where an hour later when you're done with the equation, you realize the whole thing's wrong, right? You can just push Control F on your Google Doc or on your Word doc and find the word and fix it up really quickly. So those are 2 reasons why I love English. Also, language or style should be clear and should be appropriate for both the occasion and the rhetor. Again, let's use the college professor or college writer versus the member of NWA, right? If the member of NWA started speaking like a college professor, I'm sure most of their audience would be weirded out. On the same token, right, in the same vein, if a college academic scholar, as we all are in this space, starts writing in the language of someone from NWA, then their audience, their peers and their instructor are going to go, probably not the best language to use, right? So we have to use language that's clear and appropriate for both the occasion and the person sharing the rhetoric, right? The rhetor. So let's think about these times and occasions. Well, we have 3 because we have 3 tenses, really. The first one being deliberative. We deliberate about what's going to happen in the future. We take what we already have, right? We look at what we've got and we make decisions for the future. We deliberate. The judicial or forensic concerns the past. So when you talk about forensics, what we're talking about, if you've ever watched Dexter or Law and Order SVU and they have like the forensic scientist, that's a person who is entering a crime scene that's already happened, right? That happened in the past. And they're looking at all of the information they have. It's not everything, because usually the person who committed the crime is long gone and that's what they're trying to figure out. But they're looking at all of these information from the past, from an event that occurred in the past, and they're trying to piece it together. And then we have demonstrative, or what are called epidectic arguments, and those concern the present moment in time. These are usually ceremonial or ritualistic or culturally relevant. So things like a graduation speech, the best man speech at a wedding, an inauguration, those are forms of demonstrative or epidectic arguments. They are really taking a moment to focus on what is happening at that time in that space, usually to celebrate it, but not always. And so they make up the present tense. All right, now let's talk briefly about Plato's Allegory of the Cave. I know we talked about this a little bit in the other video, but I just want to keep some things in mind, right? Before we start, let's talk about some literary elements. The first one being allegory, hence the title. And what is an allegory? An allegory is a text that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, which is usually moral or political in nature. It doesn't always, but when we say political, I'm not talking Democrat or Republican. We're talking about we as citizens who exist in any sort of space, larger geographic space, larger demographic space, where our actions inevitably influence policy, the behavior of others, other people's actions and choices, et cetera, et cetera. So if we think about the allegory of the cave, keeping that in mind, what are the moral or political hidden meanings there? And an allegory usually contains symbols because it's metaphoric, right? Because the meaning is hidden, because it's something to represent something else. So we need symbols in order to achieve that. And symbolism is the use of an image, object, character, or what have you to represent or reference an idea, a quality, or a person. So the most ready to mind example I thought of was, The Great Gatsby, which I feel like 99.9% of us were forced to read at some point in high school, which is unfortunate because it's a pretty great book, but when you feel like you're forced to read something, it kind of loses some of the joy out of it. If you ever get to go back and read it as adults, I bet you'll get more out of it. But anyway, I digress. The Great Gatsby has a ton of symbols, right? You have the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. You have the green light across the way. You have the car. You have the color yellow, right? So we have all of these different symbols that represent something or another. Same with, if those of you who've seen The Matrix, a lot of people talk about how The Matrix is an allegory for A, B, or C. And a few years ago, one of the Wachowski siblings actually came out and said, it was an allegory for her experience as a trans woman. So, those are some examples we can utilize. And so thinking about these terms, what do you think the following symbolize from this allegory, from the allegory of the cave? What does the cave symbolize or represent? The prisoners in general. The prisoner specifically who breaks free. What do the images on the wall symbolize or represent? Again, not just within the context of the allegory, but broader, outside. That's what we're talking about, kind of context. What about the people who create the images? What about the sun and outside? Because it's not just people that can be metaphors or representations. Objects overwhelmingly can symbolize things in these texts. And as we read throughout the course of the semester, we should always be looking for symbols, right? For things that stand in for something else. Considering these symbols, for what do you think Plato's dialogic is an allegory? What do you think it's an allegory of? And by dialogic, I just mean it's a dialogue, right? There's two people talking, and one asks questions and the other one keeps sort of answering, right? Well, if the prisoner does this, what does that mean? Well, this definitely means this, blah, 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 right? And here's what I will say, again, to really push this idea of the artistic proof. Avoid defaulting to Google for your answer. Because again, rhetoric's not math. If you think it symbolizes Professor King's English 104 class, that's cool. If you think it's an allegory for Bambi, cool. As long as you've got the evidence and you can logically explain how you got there in a way that your audience is going to go, okay, I can see that. Go nuts, riff. Those of you who are musicians, just riff. Let your brain riff on these ideas. It's not about being perfect at this point. It's just about getting those creative, those imaginative juices flowing. Because I can guarantee you, Plato did not write this allegory thinking, several thousand years from now, a bunch of people in an English class in Fullerton are going to be talking about this. So they better have the one right answer that I mean for them to have as I'm crafting this narrative. No, he wanted people to apply in different ways. He wanted them to be able to see that we could apply this here, we could apply this there, we could apply this. That's why it's an allegory. So keep that in mind, right? Like, try to avoid Google, because I want to see your individual, unique, thoughtful responses. I always want to see that. More so than I want to see perfection or, smarts, whatever you think that very ambiguous term to mean. I want to see you in these explications, in these applications, in these analyses. Tell me what you think. And with that, I will take it off the stop share. And I will tell you once again, if you have any questions beyond this video, please feel free to contact me. Zoom, email, Zoom is office hours. Zoom, email, Canvas messaging. Again, if none of my office hours that are posted work, please feel free to contact me and we can set aside a time that does. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend, and I will see you all in cyberspace. Bye-bye.